Good day. Welcome to the latest Straight Up Hangout, a weekly event presented by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. Today's topic is customizing the control panel in Craft for users and admins. And we've got a nice turnout here. With us, let me go from left to right. We have Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107 making his entrance. Leah from A Bright Umbrella. Lindsay from Double Secret Agency, Michael Brogg from Top Shelf Craft, Selvin from Kingdom Advisors, Steve from Pixel Jitsu, and I'm Ben from Barrel Strength Design. So we build craft sites and then we get to share them with clients, and sometimes they're nice and easy to use. I've been emailed by clients saying, no, we can cancel that training, we got it all figured out. I know how to use Craft already. And so that's always a nice email to get, but sometimes you're working with more advanced sites or more custom situations, and we want to customize that control panel to make things a little easier or harder, or whatever our goals are. So we're going to go through Craft and kind of look at native ways that Craft can do this, and then start looking at a handful of plugins and other ways we can explore customizing the control panel. So I can jump right in to get started, or would anybody else like to frame the problem or how you think about approaching customizing the control panel?
I could start. It'd be kind of jumping in the middle, but I could probably start.
Oh, what middle?
Now already.
Okay.
Why don't you tell us how you think about it?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you think about it. This is a non-linear event, so.
Well, yeah, if you're going to get into, like, let's save the custom code for later, but if you want to give the general approach, we can go for that now.
Well, like, why would we want to do this? How
Yeah.
about we answer that question?
That's a great question, and I would say that the number one reason is to make it feel like the client truly owns the CMS. You know, Craft is fantastic. It's really easy to use, but it really helps sell the product when it has the client's colors in there and when it has the client's logos in there. And it's really common also, or at least in my experience, it's been really common that a client has some weird requests about, oh, I don't want to see this button, or we need a thing that goes here, and kind of outside of the scope of what Craft does out of the box, but it's not hard to hack in via CSS or JavaScript. Let me show you a couple things.
Hey, Lindsay, let's wait on the hacking for a moment.
Sure.
We want to see it.
I can wait.
Let me jump in with my philosophy on that. So when I'm customizing the control panel, aside from just the niceties of branding and making the client feel at home in their own CMS, I tend to think about the way my client or the way my content editors conceive of their own content, right? Because what the CMS is doing is putting a big abstraction layer on top of all of the content in the system, and my job is to think about, like, how does this website and how does the content look in my client's head? You know, is it a tree structure? Is it an outline? Is it a checklist of things to do? So when they log in and their task is to make an update to their website, like, how does that task look in their head, and how can I make the CMS match as closely as possible the way that they already think about their stuff?
Yeah, and I think even more broadly, if someone has hired you to do a highly customized site, which is usually why we're using Craft, making it look like it is highly customized to them as opposed to, you know, just a generic admin CP backend is probably a good thing.
And an opportunity I like here too is often in the past, often the only option you had was to provide documentation alongside a website, which is a disconnected medium from the medium that people are working in and that people have their questions in. And with Craft, we do have a lot of opportunity to start bringing that documentation in the website and like merging them. So when somebody is editing a specific type of content, you can start educating them on or presenting them answers to the questions that they might most commonly have in that context, and they don't have to go find a separate documentation page that tells them how that works. All right, well,
yeah. Oh, I just wanted to put in my 2 cents that I'm definitely in line with what Michael was mentioning. But the other level that I think about it is really shortening the distance from edit to post. Like, how do I get them the least amount of clicks? Because sometimes an issue when you're designing the control panel is you can literally have so many different levels, like should this be an entry type versus another category versus this, that, or the other. And I usually decide, well, which one gives them the least amount of clicks and friction in regards to getting it to post.
Great. All right, well, let me share my screen and we'll walk through a handful of basic things that Craft has, and folks can jump in, and we'll work towards that more complex scenario, Lindsay, where we can see some of those examples you were talking about. All right, so here we go. We've got our Happy Logger site. This is the default Craft demo site, and I'm just going to quickly walk through a handful of things that Craft lets us do out of the box to customize this site for client or workflow considerations. So in our settings area, our general tab, right off the bat, we can add a logo for our login area. So if I were to access the admin area, you can customize the logo that's on that page. You can update the site icon, which is one thing that appears up here in the left. Then I've got my short list, folks, so if I miss anything along the way, please let me know. Then another area is on every field that we create, we get instructions. So you can ask how to do something. You can add instructions to a particular field, and as content is being edited, if we just edit our About page, we might see those instructions. If I save that and refresh, we have a way to kind of communicate in line, something about this field is unique and you should know about it. Or this is the image size, you should really be updating this image at. Going a step further, we can, on our entries tabs, Craft gives us the ability to customize the columns here as well as the sidebar. This little gear down here will allow us to select from one of many fields that we might want to see in that list and organize which order they appear in. And then if we decide that we want a separate organization structure along here, we could even add a new heading and place a group of sub-items in that heading. This tends to start becoming handy in my experience where you're using entries for things like navigation or sub-modules, components, blurbs, things that aren't necessarily content, but you want to break them out. And the columns tend to be really handy for when the title or the default information isn't the primary information people need to know about when they're editing that content. And then finally, on my list of default items here, a big one is permissions. Who has access to see what to begin with? And you can create a new user group. You can decide which sections they are able to edit, which sections they can see, and various other things. There's a lot of options, and plugins can give you more options there as well.
And on that note, I think it's worth mentioning that let's say you disable all of the assets, so a certain user group has access to 0 asset sources, the little assets tab on the left will disappear. Same thing with globals, or if they don't have access to manage users, the users link will disappear. So this left nav here will reflect the permissions of that user or user group.
And one thing I think we've run into with permissions, I'm curious how others have run into it as well, is sometimes Craft will release an update and the permissions will change slightly. And I believe the default is that when permissions change, they get set to off by default, or when you add a new section to the site, it's set to off by default. So if you have several user groups who you expect to have access to a new section you created or the feature that Craft just added, you might have to go through all those user groups and update each of them.
So it's funny that you say that. So there's one project in particular that I do a ton of work on, constantly adding stuff, constant communications with the client. And so a lot of times I'll add a new section, and I'll do some stuff, and then I'll shoot him a link, and I'll say, check this out. And he immediately writes back and says, it says I don't have access to that page. Can't tell you how many times that's happened. So it's like you just said. When you create a new section, by default, none of your user groups, except for admins, of course, but none of your user groups have access. You then have to go and give them access. And from a security standpoint, this is absolutely the right answer. This is exactly the way it should work. I don't doubt it at all. But from a UX standpoint, I've tripped myself up many times just kind of making this assumption of, oh, well, I created this section. I can see the section. Of course, my client should be able to see the section, and I need to go back and give him permission to do so.
How is everybody handling that when you have a site with several user groups? Do you log in and test from every user group, or do you just trust that the settings will probably work out? I've checked the right boxes.
Well,
If it's complicated enough. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
It used to be that I would just wait until the client complained that they couldn't log in or they couldn't get at something. But no, I mean, I try to just, whenever I've made a bunch of changes and before I'm about to show it to someone, I just go to the access page and I look at it and make sure that everything is kind of set the way it should be for each group. But logging in as each user is not a bad idea either, for sure.
Yeah, and it's worth noting you can log in, and I should probably create a new user to show this, but you can log in as another user in Craft.
We actually use concept JS to run to basically automate this kind of stuff, because I think we have anywhere from 10 to 30 different people accessing the site with different permissions, and some of them are content administrators, others are people that work with the users primarily. So with integration testing, you can automate all of that, and we powered how those tests are run through a mapping that we create. So we basically say that a specific group can see certain things. So there's 20 to 30 different URLs that each user will hit, and they will see if they have access to certain things, and then we'll get a report of that through concept.js.
And here's the quick version. In the user's account, once you select that user, you can come in and log in as test, which is the user's name that I created here. But that will log you in, and if they don't have access to the control panel, you'll be redirected to the front end. If they do, I'm not sure where you're redirected, but you could move around the control panel and see what it looks like. All right, would anybody like to comment on any other kind of native options we have on out of the box in Craft? Shall we keep moving to more custom stuff?
Would it be useful to show a couple examples of some of the native stuff in place?
You mean, do you have some to share, or?
Yeah, I've got a couple that I can can share from recent projects.
Yeah, if you'd, I'm fine to see a few real life examples. I think it's, yeah, I tend to use Happy Logger in these things, so it's always nice to see real world
Yeah,
implementations.
so one of the things that you mentioned we make heavy use of, and let me share my screen. Um,
And if anybody out there has any questions, feel free to post them to the Hangout, and we'll try to work them in as we can. Or if you have any tips of how you do it, feel free to post.
Right. So let's see. I think you can see my CMS now, right?
Yep, and I've selected you.
Okay. I promise I have applied the critical update. This is not a production site. um, so I have the item that you mentioned that I make a lot of use of is Craft's ability to customize which fields, which custom field values show up in the element indexes, like the entry index here. And what's really cool is, by default, you get all of the custom fields available as columns, but you can also add your own. You can use an extension hook that lets you add your own custom columns. So, for example, here I'm editing a list of articles on this site, and I'm using these columns to give my client sort of a content audit, so they can easily see if an article is missing an image, and they get a little thumbnail of the image, and that is provided natively by just selecting that custom field. That's an asset field, and they get to see this image. But then also I have these, there's a status field for this article, and then I went and wrote, I mean, it's like 3 lines of extension code that, depending on what the status option is for this article, either displays a check mark or a little warning exclamation or an error icon. And so they can kind of see, okay, well, these articles are done, and these articles still have something left to be done on them. And so I use those custom columns a ton to help clients audit their own content and sort of see the to-do list for a big library.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure you're doing this here, but it almost looks like you could remove the expiry column maybe, or like often you can remove like author and expiry and other things that Craft has in there by default, because those aren't too important to the specific content. And what you're doing here is really cool.
Yeah, like for example, this column is imported, and it's because we did a big content import from an expression engine site, and so we had a little icon that if an article had newly imported content, it showed them a little warning, and then somebody would go make sure that that content was the way they wanted it, and then they'd remove that flag. And so, yeah, I could clean this up a lot if I wanted to remove the expiry date column because we're not using that anymore, and I removed the import flag because that's in the past, and then there's even more room for the columns that I kept. But of course, this isn't limited just to entries. We also use this on projects for our users, and actually, I can't show you that page because it has people's email addresses on it. But I'll use columns to like flag a user as being part of a team, and that way, because everybody has different email addresses with different domain names, and it gives everybody a way to see, okay, this person is working with the agency team, and this person is working with the home client, and this person is working with me, and this person is working with the SEO consultant. And so it kind of it gives a sense of everyone has a belonging in this this list of people who are in the site. So yeah, love those custom columns.
Nice example to share. Thank you.
At a recent, I was at a meetup with some expression engine developers, and they looked at that and they're like, "Oh, it's like Zenbu for Craft, but it's built in," and it kind of is, and it's really very useful and very handy.
Yeah. Yeah. All right then. Well, let's keep moving. Next level of customization here. We start. I guess Michael kind of started us on that. We can write plugins that start modifying what's available to us or doing new things entirely. I've got a few, but I think as soon as we open this plugin door, like the number of options increases exponentially. So let me start with a few, and if any of you have your own that you'd like to share, please let's do that. So let me share. All right, so a few that I tried to pick a handful that kind of illustrated the different types of customization that you could do. Most of these plugins are actually fairly simple to write. So if you see one that you really like but you wish it worked a little different, it's quite possible that you could recreate something that tweaked it in the flavor that you liked fairly easily or for your client's needs. So.
That being said, virtually all of them are on GitHub and available to fork.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say like I don't know if any of these are, yeah, much more than 3 or 4 files or something large. So. All right, so I wanted to start with Expanded Singles is a plugin by Josh Crawford. Here we have our entries. Might open a second settings tab to jump between them here. So expanded singles, by default, Craft kind of has all your singles grouped together and then all your other sections out here on the side. You can edit the sections and sidebar headings, but you can never really do anything with the singles. They're always kind of in this separate world. Expanded singles lets you kind of turn on a setting here, and if we refresh our entries page, that singles tab disappears and all of our singles get brought to the top level. So now we can kind of take those singles and work them into our content where we feel they belong, if we feel they have a better home than being grouped as the more technical topic of singles. So that one, I guess that plugin uses the similar hooks to what Michael was just showing. So there's hooks in Craft that can help you modify the sidebar here. There's hooks that help you modify the columns, and there's hooks that help you modify the sortable attributes, if you have any special needs there. All right. The next plugins. So there's a couple plugins out there that do like help documentation or users. So I was going to install one of those. Here's help by 70K feet. You install it. You refresh, and you've got a help section here. And I created a very little one. I believe the settings are, again, very simple. You're telling it where are the templates that you want to be using, and then you can kind of create this inbuilt help section for your clients. It is, let me show the file structure for that real quick. I've created a help folder for their settings, and I've just been able to kind of create my own twig files with whatever HTML I want in them here. You control the title with this little comment, and then you kind of have free reign to write whatever you want for your help documentation. And there's another one I thought was illustrating something pretty cool to user manual. So again, kind of solving a similar problem. This one lets you rename the plugin, a big feature, high value feature on my list.
We know that's your thing.
But it also lets you it basically lets you pick a channel that you've created in Craft. So I'm just going to pick the Happy Logger Services section, but you could have a structure or a channel that's called help documentation that your users, your clients even, can update just like they're updating all the rest of their Craft stuff. And let me see what folder I created this in. You kind of create a custom template for that just kind of has the body content of what you'd like it to display. And we refresh again. Here's our user manual. And this is not well styled right now, but we're pulling in the same entries that we would have here on the services section of the website. So just as this page on the front end gives us content, it's pulling in that same content and styling it with the craft control panel.
Will that still work if the client doesn't have edit access on that section? So could you write a manual that they themselves couldn't accidentally edit or delete?
Yeah, I believe it's just permissions to whoever has access to edit that section can edit it.
But you can still see it?
Yeah, I bet you could even add condition. Oh, yeah, you could even add conditionals in your templates probably that said like if user group was something, don't display something, and if user group was something else, do. It's just a your standard Twig template outputting your content just like any other page. Is anybody here using help documentation? Is this something we often use on sites?
You know, I explored a couple of them, specifically the help one, and it looks really good. But what I found was that craft is pretty self-explanatory. You know, I haven't had a ton of, in fact, I've had virtually no instances of a client coming to me and saying, I just don't understand how this works, or where's the thing, you know, I mean, 5 minutes of me talking about it is usually enough. So as much as I really like, I haven't seen the user manual one, but as much as I like the help plugin, I've never actually found a viable need for it.
Yeah, for us, I tend to use those plugins when I have developed some custom solution, you know, some kind of workflow for importing data from a remote feed, or you know, I don't know, something that is not part of Craft, just normal entry editing workflow, and then I'll make a little screen capture, like a screencast, and I'll pop it onto a help page, you know, and that way, you know, the client, it's pretty self-explanatory from just Craft's UX how to edit text and save an entry, but maybe the client doesn't remember how to run the custom task that we set up for them, and so we make them a little screen capture and we put it in a help page, and that's when I find those sorts of plugins useful.
Yeah, anything that takes more than 2 steps.
Yeah. Or anything that the client couldn't find, you know, on one of Craft's, you know, demo videos or something.
Yeah, you could potentially even embed a handful of Craft's demo videos in a page like this or something like that, or other demo videos that you created. I like that.
Yeah, the nice thing is that it's, you know, it's bring your own HTML, so I'll just pop a video player in there, and they love that.
Yeah, I don't normally use those because I don't want to write all that crap every time. You know, I used to work somewhere where we provided printed manuals that were, you know, for expression engine sites, and that was a nightmare. They never use it.
Yeah. What I've traditionally done is I set up a wiki for every page that I'm using, but I actually kind of like the idea of it being integrated in the control panel. I just haven't found anything that is going to... I mean, the real key to using a wiki is that it's super easy to add stuff to it, both for you and occasionally the client.
I've had more success with like field notes, or even like a little help tab in the entry type with some field notes on what they're doing right then, instead of trying to go and look it up somewhere else. It's really nice to have it in the edit window.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Steve just said. Ben, remind me which barrel strength plugin, which Sprout plugin has the notes field. It's just fields, right? Sprout fields?
Yeah, Sprout fields.
So I've used that a few times, and, you know, like Steve's saying, it's better to just nudge them at the moment that they need it, because it's human nature to not read the manual. right? So why don't you just put the little, and you know, fortunately Craft has a description. For every field you can put a description in, but some things can't be summed up in 1 or 2 sentences, and when that's the case, you know, turning to Sprout Fields and sticking a notes field in there, man, you can solve so many problems with that.
Yeah. I found that if the description is too long, they complain about it taking up the edit space. So I'll just move it to a help tab and it'll, like, you know, use this number format, see help for more details, and they just click on the tab and read it. You know, that's another thing I try to do as much as possible is make it so that, you know, their input masks and it's really hard for them to screw up the content when they're entering it. You know, I always restrict it to the right image folder, just sort of make it so that it's very difficult for the client to mess it up to begin with, and then they don't bug you as much.
So I have an example of Sprout Fields here to show as well, so I'll jump to that one. So Sprout Fields gives us a field type that doesn't take any user input. It just allows you to output HTML or Markdown or rich text content. And it comes with a few styles as well. So here I have it on the home page, and like I believe it was Lindsay that said, it's like when this, we use this a lot, when this like instructional text becomes too lengthy, more than a couple sentences or more than a sentence or two, whatever you have here starts to feel like it's getting burdensome, we frequently find ourselves using something like a notes field that just allows you to break it out and kind of frame the concept. You could add images or video or whatever. And Sprout Fields also lets users collapse those if they don't want to see those, so that will retain state based on whichever user decides to open or close it there. So just to show the settings there, the settings are a little like, you don't have to change them much, but we do have global settings that allow you to kind of set up different styles for your fields if you want a couple different colors for something that's important or less important. And then in the fields themselves, you can kind of choose between Markdown, rich text, or HTML depending on how you like to, and change the color or output. I was just playing around. You can add HTML that Craft uses as well. So in this case, I just added this is the Craft info bubble. So if we refresh, we see we get a different style, and there's this little info bubble that would provide a pop-up. not really important or necessary, but just to illustrate that if you see something in the Craft admin panel, it's kind of already rendering that HTML for you. If you
that info bubble is cool. I never knew about that. Could you stick that info bubble into the standard description as well?
I don't believe this description renders HTML. Can anybody?
Because it renders Markdown, and in theory, Markdown also parses HTML. I don't know how true that is.
I tried basic HTML in the instructions field and didn't see it working. So I'd have to test to know the answer there.
Okay.
So one very small caveat to this is obviously there are different kinds of help, and the help that you add to the fields while they're entering it, I think, is fantastic. The only thing to keep in mind is that keep an offline version of this stuff. For some reason the site is down. If they can't access the documentation that tells them how to access the site, obviously there's a problem. And that is one of the reasons why I do, separate docs for this stuff. But I do think there's a ton of value in terms of the client satisfaction and not asking you questions for putting that kind of inline instructions in there as well.
So here's our test, live test. I just added an HTML tag to the instructions field, and we get an HTML tag output.
Yeah, so no love there, huh?
So I guess, yeah. Not sure why they do or don't do that. That's how it works.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
So yeah, again, like a notes field too, it's a fairly simple thing to set up if you like had your own styles you wanted, or I guess Sprout fields, we try to allow you to customize your styles in the settings, but if you just wanted to build your own field, this is a great starter plugin type topic if you want to get into doing something your own style there. All right, then I guess I mean, there's plenty of other plugins we can speak to, but I think maybe this is a good transition into like, okay, there's lots of plugins that help us start to customize these workflows. What if we just want to get a little more specific in how we're modifying the control panel? So Lindsay, Lindsay has two plugins, Control Panel CSS and Control Panel JS, which allow users to, I'll demo this, but maybe then hand off to Lindsay. Here you have Control Panel CSS. If you click on it, it pretty much just gives you a field that you can add CSS to that gets loaded when the control panel gets loaded. So what do you see people using this stuff for, Lindsay?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you've got this screen up. Let me talk about this for 10 seconds. So the additional CSS, you can literally type CSS directly in here. I forget what JavaScript library I threw in there, but it color codes the CSS, which is helpful. And then the field above that one is if you want to reference an external CSS file, it's obviously you don't necessarily want to stick all of your data directly into this field if it's long, or if you want to, say, version control it, you'd reference an external CSS file. And so then the priority between these is that it'll load the CSS file first, and then the additional CSS would actually follow up and override anything that you set in the file.
You can use all your important tags here.
Exactly. That's where your important stuff goes. So there's.
All right. So, do you have any examples that you could share?
Yep.
Or
let me let me
me
share my screen here.
Out of curiosity, in the group here, how many folks are going farther than plugin customization of the control panel and using custom CSS or JS to tweak something in this type of way?
Well, I've gone pretty far. I'll show you one in a minute. I'll show you like one or two basic ones, and then I'll show you one that's more complex where I've really kind of gone off the deep end with using CSS and JavaScript to just totally morph craft into, it's not unrecognizable, it's still very much craft, but I'm just chopping off all sorts of weird corners and creating my own things that need to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sharing my screen. I don't know if you're looking at it right now.
Yep, I see it.
This one is a site that is just, it's a valet site. It's nothing too fancy here, but their colors are blue and yellow. And what we did then was take that in addition to their logo. So Ben showed you earlier how to use the logo. And what we did is we then made this blue. We made the buttons blue with a rollover of yellow. We made the H1 tags blue. And then we kind of stopped. And to be honest, that's what we do on like 90% of sites. We give them their colors. We give them the button colors. We make sure that the logo exists here. We make sure that the login page, actually, I think the login page is going to look good, fingers crossed.
Just open it in an incognito.
And so the login page, we did the black background because it looked better with this version of their logo. And so that's it. And then that's kind of where we stop for most sites.
Could you, how much CSS does it take to do something like that?
I could pull it up. In fact, instead of pulling up that specific site, I'm going to pull up what is in our base install. So our base install runs down a very short list, right? And so this is Sass. I'm going to run the assumption that everybody knows how to read Sass. And so we're basically pulling in the variables, which is just a bunch of colors. So here's our variables, literally a list of colors. I'm going to pull in the mix-ins, which I'll circle back to in a second. And then one by one, I just hit all these mix-ins.
Could you increase your font size a few?
Sure.
Just.
What do I push in Sublime? Is it?
It's like Option Scroll in in Sublime it's Command plus, I believe.
Command. How's that? More? Less?
That works.
And is that going to hold up across tabs? Yes, it will. Okay. So this is my list of colors, and I take that list of colors and I feed them back into my mix-ins. And my mix-ins are very straightforward. So there's this hide updates icon one, which I'll talk about in a second, but otherwise it's what's your header color, which is actually now sidebar color. Some of these are named pre 2.5. So header color, page background color, H1 tags color, button color. Those are really self-explanatory. And then the Sass mix-ins look like this. You know, what's the header color? Well, let's set the header. What's the page background color? Now this applies to a few different ones, and that's fine. They're all collected here. Tags color, button color. This one's interesting because we use the darken property. I don't know what you call it in Sass. Function, I guess, to control the hover state. But otherwise, we're just passing in the single color. And then the last one is this hide updates icon, and some people know this is a tiny pet peeve of mine, is that starburst icon that appears that says how many updates are available. While it's awesome when you're an admin, or I should say, well, it's awesome when you're somebody who can automatically auto-update, it's not awesome when you can't do that. And so that being said, I know there's this whole admin versus non-admin, and non-admins technically can't see that at all. Some of my clients are admins, or to be honest, even if I don't want to see that starburst, I'll turn it off. And this is more important when you use the, what's the config setting?
Allow updates?
Yes.
I was going to ask that actually. Why don't you just use the allow updates and just turn it off?
Because if you disable allow auto updates on allow auto updates, okay, so if
it still shows you that there's updates, it just doesn't let you one-click install them.
Exactly. So let's say that you take this allow auto updates config setting and you use it differently in different environments. So locally, I want the ability to one-click update. But on the production server, I don't want the ability. Even for myself, I don't want myself to be able to one-click update craft on the production server because I keep the app folder in our Git repo, so that I am 100% confident that the version of craft that we're running is identical across all environments.
Yeah, and it gives you a chance to test it in dev before you push it down, and yeah.
Exactly, and there's definitely some debate on whether or not to keep app in the repo. We do, and therefore we disable auto updates for production. But like Rog just said, you still get the starburst, right? So you go on a production site and you see this big blue number up in the corner, but you can't do anything about it. And to me, that's frustrating. And so our workaround for that is this, which is global sidebar top updates display none. It literally just hides that. Pretty straightforward.
So you don't want your clients to know that you haven't updated their site in 6 months.
Nope, I don't want them to know that. You know what I'm saying? And you say that sarcastically, but it's true. I mean, there's some clients who you work on their site all the time, and there's some clients who you build their site, and then they call you again a year and a half later.
Right.
And the last thing that you want to be dealing with is, hey, that client called you because it says the number 15 in a blue starburst up in the corner.
Maybe you could write CSS that the more updates you are behind, the more red the update thing becomes. So
you hit 20, it just turns into a frowny face.
Yeah, no, so it it starts to grow in size and take over the screen.
It's angrier and angrier.
The security mod, yeah.
Exactly. So that's definitely been a use case for us, and what I'm showing you here, these files are part of our base install. So these go onto every single site, and then all we got to do is just change the colors for the site, upload the logos, and done. And that's pretty quick. So that was the base install, but sometimes you go a little crazier. And so let me show you what a little crazier looks like. So this is actually still pretty straightforward. I started doing this button thing. Maybe I'll talk about that in a minute. But here's the crazy one, right? So, before I jump into this, let me just talk about Control Panel JS, which is exactly like Control Panel CSS, except it's JavaScript. Most of the time, I find that I only need to modify the CSS, but occasionally I need to modify the JavaScript. So CPCSS is probably in pretty close to 100% of my sites, but CPJS is only in like 10 or 15% of my sites. This site is using both. And so what we're looking at here is I am not logged in as an admin. I am logged in as a user, specifically a projectionist. And so let me give you the 10-second backstory on what this site is. This site is an internal communications tool between different departments. So there is no front end of this website. It doesn't exist. There's no need for one because all they need is to be able to log into Craft as whatever user type that they are and have access to whatever fields they should have access to and not the fields that they shouldn't have access to. There are other parts of this site, like there's an asset section. Obviously, there's users. They don't have access to those. And so I'm logged in as a projectionist. The process goes through several phases. There's the department which receives this is for a film festival, right? So there's the department which receives the hard drives with the copies of the films. This is the receiving department. And I could log in as a member of the receiving department and only have access to this field and not have access to these fields. As it stands right now, I'm logged in as a projectionist. And so I can make my notes. Here are my notes. But I can't write in here. I've locked them out of these sections. And so I use CSS to affect the colors. And then I used JavaScript to affect their ability to edit it. Right? So the JavaScript locks them out. The CSS dims or highlights their field.
That's quite clever.
No, thank you. Another thing that we've done, because when I ran this past my client, he said, here, let me pull up. This is a different website, of course. He said, what's all this stuff on the right-hand side, the entry type and the slug and the expiry date? He's like, what is that? I don't think we need that. And I was like, you don't need that. And so what I did here is I hid the sidebar. I hid the sidebar, and now when I hid the sidebar, the problem is that this center column didn't get wider, which in some ways is fine, but it left this weird large gray area on the side. And so then I used JavaScript to change the classes of this container, and once I did that, boom, you now have full width. Trying to think of what else I might have done here, but this is the gist of it. You know, the idea, I did some stuff here with uploading a file. Projectionists don't have the opportunity to upload a file. I need to add a download button here, but that's a separate conversation. But they don't have the ability to upload a file, so therefore the little dotted add an asset, I hid that from them, so they don't have that either. This is one of the more extreme cases of what I've done with CSS and JavaScript, but for this particular project, it's exactly what needed to happen.
So how do you approach the considerations of Craft changing the structure of the page or the class names on you?
It's a good question, and I'm going to answer that by saying it's literally only happened once.
The 2.5?
Yep, when Craft went from 2.4 to 2.5, a handful of things changed. So my expectation is that at the earliest, at the very earliest, they're only going to do that again for 3.0, although even that is unlikely since a lot of the 2.5 visual changes were actually slated for 3.0 but pushed up to 2.5 because commerce depended on them.
And
yeah,
then,
Lindsay, I'll say that in looking at that, I think I agree, it's incredibly clever. It just makes me all the more wanting field level access permissions for users groups, in Craft Core.
so Andrew, I think you're getting to the point of like the other, so, and this is kind of another question for you too, Lindsay, of when, so Control Panel CSS and Control Panel JS give you kind of the ability to, without writing a plugin, get in there and start doing something. However, as soon as you're doing something so regularly or every single site in that way, you might consider, hey, I'm just going to make this into a plugin because it just works better that way. And what Andrew's alluding to is, so you have 3 different fields that you're kind of hacking changes to here, but you could have just created 2 new field types, or a new field type that had access level permissions and handled it that way as well.
You're talking about hypothetically if that feature existed.
Yeah, I think I remember somebody, I saw some repo on GitHub once where somebody had created like 15 new field types that pretty much just extended Craft's field types and added permissions to them.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't seen that one.
And it was, I mean, it's a little weird from the UI perspective because you got to install 15 fields that essentially duplicate the fields there, and when you're picking from your field list, you have 2 of every to choose from probably. But it is kind of that question of when is this helpful, and then when is this a hack and it should just become a plugin or a feature request?
So that's a great question, and I'll use that to segue into the next thing. Many people have talked about this, field level permissions, and there have been feature requests, and ultimately I don't think at this point Pixel and Tonic is too keen on building something like that in, partly because I don't think the right solution has really surfaced yet. Maybe if it does, that would affect things. But as of right now, if a field exists in a section, everybody has access to it. So I took a different approach. So here's CPCSS.
Because the other thing to note here is, in your case, you're not too worried about the projectionist modifying the director's comments, but I mean, if they're semi-competent in HTML, they can write themselves in as the lead role in the cast right there, couldn't they? Just edit the page and say,
it's true.
These are the new notes that we have.
It's absolutely true. What you're saying is spot on. If somebody really knew how to hack at CSS and JavaScript, they could put notes in any field right here. They're not restricted to this field only. Now that being said, my target audience is not a bunch of HTML savvy folks. So for this instance, I can get away with this.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to be the lead in every one of these movies.
Nice. So I could get away with that. And so actually, let me jump over to CP body classes, right? And so CP body classes is designed to work in tandem with CSS or JavaScript that you write. I say in here it pairs well with the CPCSS and CPJS plugins, but the truth of the matter is it doesn't have to use those plugins. You can get CSS and JavaScript in here however you want, and this will still do its thing. What it's doing is basically, based on certain circumstances, adding special classes to the body tag, right? And so then you can use CSS or JavaScript to drill down to the specific field under the specific condition that you're looking for, and hide or show. And I think actually I'm using CP body classes on this site. I think it's a critical component of it.
Yeah, I've run into that too. And I guess the area where we've run into like when I want to customize most, and I generally feel that like the urge to start hacking at something is a signal that you should listen to, and that like it's either something that you might be trying to do that you're not thinking about it right, and there's a better way to do it, or you're potentially you're finding an area where, hey, maybe this isn't the best solution. And we've run into this most in, say, the craft users area where we have multiple member groups and we need more kind of who has access to what fields, or the field needs for two different groups are just totally different for one another, or the way the user photo is being handled isn't in line with the exact way that Craft has the default user photo or the default first name, last name being handled. So Craft kind of makes a handful of assumptions about what users are, and they need to some extent, but that also is not helpful if you need a middle name field and then you have your two first and last names somewhere and your middle name on a separate custom field area, and then you add a first name on your custom field area, but you still have it on your main but your main user area as well. So
yeah, in fact, that's a. You keep talking. I'm going to see if I can find the thing else.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I run into that, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to start hacking this to get it to work, or find a way to make it to work. But I feel like more importantly, I need to go to the feature request zone and be like, hey, like, how can this work better for this use case? Because it's really just not. It's what I'm trying to do isn't possible yet. Yeah, it's like I'm really hacking the system at that.
So Ben, I have a couple of points or things to say regarding that. I mean, yeah, this is a hack, but not all hacks are bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are definitely times where something like this is adding a bunch of value to the client in a way that isn't terribly invasive, and there's currently no other way to do it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's not a giant red flag; it's a small yellow flag.
Yeah. Now that being said, you know. I'm older than dirt, so I've been around a long time, and this same kind of thing the same pattern has been repeated over and over again with things in terms of extending a system to do stuff that it doesn't do or doesn't know how to do. And you do have to be prepared for, okay, an update may come out that may break all of your admin CP CSS. Now, as Lindsay said, it's only happened once, but, it's something that you just go into it with your eyes wide open that this could potentially happen. I do agree, though, that for something like field access, I would love to see that in core, where you have the same fine-grained permissions on a per field basis in terms of who can see it, if they can see it but not edit it, or if they just can't see it at all. And I think that would be fantastic, because I've had a number of projects where it would have been super, super useful to be able to do that. So if there is something that you're running into at the same time that you're using, if you want to call it a hack or a shortcut or whatever, use that, but then make sure that you go to the feature request stuff and voice your support for adding that functionality to core.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point. There are still feature requests that still do technically address this in a quote-unquote proper fashion by kicking the can back to Pixel and Tonic and saying, like let me give you an example. This adding classes to the body and then showing and hiding via CSS and JavaScript, it is a hack, but I think it's a worthwhile hack. But when this was pitched to Pixel and Tonic using this method, this specific method was pitched for showing and hiding fields, Brandon basically said, hey, that's a security hole. Like Ben mentioned a minute ago, somebody who knows HTML and CSS and JavaScript can actually get in through the browser and give themselves access to these fields. Yep. So, on the basis of it being a security issue, they rejected that particular request. Not to say there isn't another way to go about it, but per that conversation with Brandon, we put this little disclaimer in here on the bottom that said, look, this is purely cosmetic. Somebody can actually get in here and still get access to these fields if they really want to. So we are not responsible if somebody hacks your website because you use this plugin.
Yeah, safe conditions where it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so,
as Steve mentioned in chat, I mean, that's kind of security through obscurity in a way.
Mm-hmm. You can always bank on the fact that if they can't see a field, they don't know what they're missing. But you're still technically in that security vulnerability.
Yeah, I'm cool with that kind of thing as long as it's like the exception to what you're doing. If you make that kind of stuff a practice, and it changes, and suddenly you have like 20 sites you've got to go and fix, then you've really painted yourself into a corner. I'll do a hack like that as a one-off, but not, as a general. Let's do it on every site.
Yeah, you know, and I think actually if you tie a few of these comments together, you start talking about a real security issue, which is what if Craft changes the classes that they're using, and then suddenly all of your fields are available because your CSS and JavaScript doesn't line up anymore.
Because you weren't hiding the updates tab.
Lindsay,
Yeah.
Lindsay, you are an evil genius. You just got yourself a ton more billable hours when that happens.
That's right.
To go in there and fix them all.
Like, looks like somebody hacked your mainframe here.
So here's another question about doing this. How do you plan for the future when you're doing this? We inherit a lot of sites from other developers. One of them was recently using Control Panel CSS, and for some reason they decided to reduce the kerning of all the fonts in the whole CP, and it just feels weird to be in the Control Panel for me. But that's a simple example, but more importantly, in more complex scenarios, if you're doing things on page load that other people don't know about, they don't even know where to change them. So and I think we can say that clients move around in our industry for one reason or another. How do you plan for the future in your own code, or when you inherit somebody else's that's doing a bunch of this stuff? How do you even know where to look?
Well, I'd say a couple of things about that, and I think the number one thing I would say is you can't always plan for it. You can try, you can do your best to prepare, and if you're preparing for your code to leave your hands and go to someone else, one of the best things you can do is comment your code. And if you're trying to figure out, if you get code from someone else and you're trying to figure out how they put it together or what's triggering that, you might need to know some stuff, and you don't know what you don't know. But like look at Rog's example, right? And actually here I've got an example of it too. So I'll show you. Yeah.
You mean the help doc? Actually create a help doc that calls out what you're doing.
A help doc, actually, that's one of the better ways to do it. I think that's a great comment. The help docs that you were demoing before is a good way to keep track of any hacks that you might have done. So, but what I was going to show you here is this this column right here, this KDM column, and Rog had a few examples of this in his entries index, which is a custom column or a modified column that has icons, or this is a fairly straightforward numeric column, but when there's 0, I got a little red dot because it means, hey, you need to come back here and attend to this. And Rog had a little warning signs like, hey, you need to come back here and attend to this. Let me see if I can see. Okay, so what's the boom? Okay. So this is what's modifying the columns, right? Modify entry sources. And I'm actually glad that we circled back on this, because when Rog was showing it off, I was thinking somebody needs to talk about this, right? So so not sources. Sources is actually what shows up in the left column. And so what I've done here, and fortunately I commented it, so it's self-explanatory, that all entries, there's only one type of entry. There's only one section. And so all entries was redundant. And so what I did was I basically removed that source. And so all you see is the only section that's in there. These other ones go on to modify the columns, right? And so we have the date the drive was received, and the last time this entry was updated. And so what I want to do here is, let's see, define it. Okay, so I just added those. So these added the 2 columns when it was received and when we updated it. And then this modifies, okay, so first hard drive received actually lines up with this one, so field 35. So then I modify that per this method down here. And I basically just reformatted the date. There's nothing too fancy going on there. I just gave it a very specific date format other than the generic date format that Craft wanted to use. And then this other field, KDM, is not added here. That's different. And so the KDM is where I say, okay, The KDM is basically an assets field. So just think of it as being a very generic assets field. And if you look at it in the column in the index listing, it's going to tell you how many. Is that right? I may be misrepresenting my logic here. But either way, it's either showing you a number or showing you this red status icon. And that's pretty simple. That's pretty straightforward stuff. And now I'm sure Rog had something very similar in his, to where there was some sort of flag, and if the flag is set, you show the warning logo, and if the flag is unset, it goes away, or it turns into a green check mark.
For anybody out there who's interested in modifying like this, these things are called element hooks, and you'll find them in the hooks reference in the craft documentation. You'll find them for several different elements, entries, users, categories, and so on.
That's right. These three right here are standard craft hooks. I think that pretty much does it. Oh, and by the way, this is just in a generic business logic plugin. There's nothing fancy about where I put this. I think that's pretty much it for me. Unless you feel like I missed something. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll bounce it back to somebody else here.
Yeah, no, that was a good exploration of how far you can take this customization process. So thank you. Does anybody else have any tips or tricks they use, or?
Somebody's got a wig layup here.
We know she thinks about this stuff.
I can mention another plugin that I really like, which is not like a customization so much as it's just an element that you can include on your site. But I really, I should say, my clients really like an add-on called Content Stats, which is by a guy named Will Brower, I think.
Brower. He's my brother-in-law, so that's why I know it.
Is it really? Huh.
He really is.
And it looks like this. So it gives you this dashboard widget, and for each of your sections, and you can toggle your sections on and off. It just shows you how many of them there are in the system. And I think there's other different kinds of stats that you can include. It's pretty customizable. But and then if you click on them, then it takes you to the page. So yeah, I like that a lot, and it's called Content Stats. It's kind of a fun toy. I don't know that it is like super. I don't know how much actual value it has as a utility, but clients really like it. It's a point of pride. Look how many blog entries I have.
Then Michael, you just pointed out the utility in it. Right? Yeah. If clients really like it, then it has great utility, right?
Yeah.
Inherently.
There's some interesting stuff happening on this front with Craft 2 right now. They just recently added a charting API, and I know we've added it to a few of our plugins where you can now kind of see the form entries that are coming in as a graph. I think there's a few other plugins that are starting to use it as well. And then, of course, the Duct Analytics plugin that kind of allows you to add your Google Analytics graphs to that dashboard area if you want to give, some visibility into what's happening on the site.
So I didn't think I would have anything other than making dumb comments for this, but I actually have something. If you look at my screen, this is what you were just talking about, and it's something I do for just about every client, is the Duct Analytics plugin. They love it. You install it, they go to their home page, and they can see, what are their page views and what things are being viewed. Because a lot of these guys, I set up Google Analytics for them, but they don't even know how to log in and look at that stuff. Some of the smaller clients. So giving them something like this where they can see where their traffic is coming from and, where they're being referred from and all that kind of stuff is really pretty cool.
Yeah, it kind of makes it feel like the website has a reason to, rather than the most recent blog post from Pixel and Tonic, how we might enjoy them.
Right.
It just doesn't feel relevant to a client's business who's focused on the success of something else.
Right.
I think there's also like a Facebook Reach plugin now that'll show you your mentions in Facebook for a given URL on your site.
Great.
I'd like to ask a question. Does anybody miss the field layouts in Expression Engine?
Trying to think what they even look like.
I miss Expression Engine every day.
Really? What about the field layouts? Are you?
Well, you used to be able to like drag the fields beside each other and sort of arrange them in the control panel in a way that made sense for the content.
So you could even like say have two plain text fields that came after one each other and then kind of adjust them to be 50-50 so you had two fields next to one another.
Now I wonder, I do miss that functionality. I wonder if that is still there in EE3, because one of the reasons why Craft doesn't do that is so that it can intelligently handle responsive layout. And that has been an issue for some of my clients that want to access the admin CP from their mobile phone exclusively.
Yeah.
And on Expression Engine, it's pretty painful. I know that with EE3 they made adjustments so that it's more responsive friendly. So I don't know if it's possible that went away, because there are certain types of layouts that to be able to handle the arbitrary layout of fields and have it work well at a number of responsive sizes is not a trivial problem.
No, definitely not. And actually we do Expression Engine work still, and
is it still there?
Yeah, it is. Or actually, I don't know if it is in Expression Engine 3.
That's what I'm asking.
But no, I don't remember if it's still there in Expression Engine 3. But I do sometimes in Craft miss the ability to stack different fields on a row, and there's obvious reasons why it is not optimal to do that. But by and large, my clients edit their content on a big giant screen, and so for my clients, being able to arrange the fields was really nice. I'll tell you what else I miss sometimes is on my Expression Engine sites, we use Zoo Flexible Admin all the time, and being able to completely hijack all of the nav and rearrange all of the nav is pretty nice. And you can do that in Craft, but it takes a lot more effort than just dragging and dropping. So that's another area where I hope that there's some development in Craft that lets us just completely rip out the control panel nav and redo it.
There is an control panel nav plugin.
Yeah, the CP nav plugin does pretty much all of what you're describing.
Oh, really?
I can share it here.
In fact, he recently added multiple layouts. So when he brought it up to speed for Craft 2.5, he added multiple layouts so that different user groups could actually have different side navs. In addition to, so you can rearrange them, you can hide the ones you don't want to see, you can rename the items on the left, and you can add a custom one if it goes off to some other website or something, or some random page within the admin panel. I'm trying to think, and in fact, I hope I'm not making this up, but I feel like he very recently added the ability to put custom icons in as well.
Yep, it's there. I've got it on my screen right now.
Oh, cool.
Oh, sorry, at the wrong screen. Yeah, so here's control panel nav by S group. What's S stand for?
That's Josh Crawford, right?
Josh Crawford, but yeah, the
super. The S is always for super.
Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
Well, here we are. It's got your layouts. You can, I think, even see them update in real time as you move them around. And if you click on this, you've got a chance to update the icon and label and stuff. It's a little unclear, like where the layouts actually tie in. I guess maybe there's a setting somewhere. You can create a layout. I don't know where you actually say which user group gets what layout.
So
maybe you have to add them.
I don't know.
Well, if you add multiple layouts, I forget.
Maybe there's a field type for it or something that.
Yeah, it's in there somewhere. So on the note of what somebody said earlier about, hey, what if Craft updates and they change some UI? When they did that for 2.5, CP nav broke pretty badly. Um,
Yeah.
but the good news is that Josh Crawford is an awesome developer, and he fixed it in like a matter of days. So it really is just a matter of staying on top of it. If you're going to release something out into the world, ideally you're providing some level of support. And if Craft comes out with a breaking change, you just kind of need to be aware of it. And so yeah, I mean, a few days later he had put out his updated version, and it fixed all the issues. And then recently he added this new custom icon thing. So yeah, all in all, it's a pretty solid plugin.
So
I'm somewhat leery about that type of thing, only because, and I'm sure everyone here has experienced it to some extent, but I have some older EE sites that are currently locked because the plugins just aren't being updated anymore. So I can't even update the expression engine site itself or the version itself because those plugins aren't available. The author is often Tahiti surfing or whatever it is he's doing. And I've even had some plugins that have been broken by external things, like there's a Google Maps plugin for Expression Engine that has been broken by changes to the Gmaps API. So it is something that I try to be kind of careful about in terms of how much dependency do I really want to have my my backend in terms of the plugins that are being used on there. I think it's kind of an eternal struggle.
Yeah, that's a case for native. I mean, like you were saying that you would really like to see granular permissions on fields, and
Yes.
I think that would be awesome. I'd also like to see like conditional fields, like in reasons, but just through the core. I'm really afraid to use anything like that, or something like Neo, where it could explode a site, and really just lost all the profit trying to fix it.
It might be something worth considering the budget of a client or the ongoing support budget in particular if you start getting into some of this stuff. Because if you're a small developer with a kind of a hobbyist client or a client with a very fixed budget, the more you try to customize in these more custom ways, the bigger chance they're coming back to you going, why is this broken? And there's no budget to fix it, and their available money is for business priorities instead of just trying to fix things that could have been cooler. Whereas if you have a $1,000 or $2,000 budget a month, you're always available on your retainer or something like that. It's easier to be regularly updating and maintaining these things, and maybe there's a chance to communicate to the client in there too. We can take extra steps to customize this further for you, but there's going to be a higher cost of maintenance in doing so.
I try to, it's a bit of a holy war about more plugins or less plugins, but my mentality is one, I try to only really stick with plugins from developers that seem trustworthy, people who speak up in the community, people who update their plugins frequently. But the other thing is I try not to put any plugins into the site, with rare exceptions. I try not to put any plugins into the site which could actually bring down the whole site, like that for the most part, with a 90% accuracy, that you could go in and just disable every plugin, and the site would still pretty much work the way it needs to.
Yeah, that's my rule of thumb as well, is especially for control panel customization stuff that is nice to have. It makes a big difference to a client, but my rule of thumb is I need to be able to just go in and turn it off and have the site still be fine. If it comes to that.
I'm kind of a Luddite when it comes to the admin CP customization. The only stuff that I do are widgets. If I find some very useful widgets that I can stick on the home page for them, I will do it. But that's pretty much all I do because I'm a little bit paranoid.
Well, and widgets fall into that category of you could disable the widgets and there's really no harm done.
Exactly.
It's a lot more difficult to disable a field type that a lot of content is relying on than it is to disable something like, control panel CSS, where where it's like, okay, my control panel will be a little bit less pretty, but the content is still intact. The data is safe.
I mean, what do you mean reverse-related entries is broke? You know, I mean, what do I do now?
So I want to bring up a comment Leah made in the chat when we were on the field topic. She mentioned that there's research out there that says side-by-side fields often don't get as much attention as fields in line because it slows users down and focuses. I think that kind of brings up an area we haven't covered too much here, but a lot of control panels customization comes in the user workflows around the fields themselves. And if you look at how people use matrix fields or table fields or the super table fields and stuff, it's usually around the content workflow for a client and trying to reduce the amount of choice they have and focus them on the task that they're really trying to accomplish without a bunch of lack of clarity in what that entails. So I don't know if we have any thoughts in that direction, or Leah, if you have any more specific ideas there, but I think, I don't know, a lot of the time we spend, I feel, is just customizing fields in that order.
Do you use a lot of tabs? Does everyone use tabs? You know,
my rule of thumb is to generally try to have every required field on the primary tab, because people just forget to tab to the second tab all the time. And then a secondary tab could have things around highlight content or layout or SEO, secondary things that are important but kind of require somebody who's specialized enough and thinking about that problem enough to be looking for the fields relating to that problem.
So in my opinion, I think about tabs in the admin CP, in the entries and that kind of thing. I think about that the same way I think about the second page of Google search results, which is that nobody looks at it. You know what I mean? So typically, if I'm using tabs, it's actually to hide stuff that, like meta or SEO or, stuff that I know that just by putting it in a tab, most of the people that are using the site are just never going to see it.
Yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily fair to say nobody looks at it, but I do tend to think in terms of task sets and roles. So when the SEO guy logs in, I don't want him distracted by stuff that has nothing to do with SEO. I want him to go straight to his tab and all of his stuff is there, and when the intern that is auditing the content goes in, I want that person to have the fields that he needs to flag stuff or unflag stuff, and then when my author goes in, I want my author to have fields for authoring and not be distracted by other stuff. So I do tend to use fields, and that's how tabs, and that's how I group them, is just like when and who is using this group of fields, and how can I make their task very uncluttered.
Well, I don't know how y'all do it down in Texas, but most of the clients that I've seen, literally.
Well, I done just told you how we do it in Texas.
Most of the clients that I've seen, if it's in a second tab, I've even had them be like, "Oh, I didn't even know that was there." So
well,
it probably depends on the savviness of the people that you're using the site.
This is why everybody says Texas clients are the smartest clients.
I don't think I've ever heard that before.
I think it boils down to two things, and my philosophy aligns a lot closer to Rog's. I think it boils down to a couple things. One, who is your target audience? And in this case, it's who is editing the content. And two, how much content are you actually dealing with? I mean, if you're dealing with a site that only has 5 fields, then yeah, put them all on a single tab. But if you're dealing with a site that has 30 fields, you're going to want to make good use of those tabs.
Sure.
Here's a challenging question. What does everybody rename the first tab in their layout, which starts off with the awesome name of tab 1?
Content.
Stuff.
It depends on what they're doing.
It does depend on what they're doing. I go with content if I don't have another option.
I tend to name them based on the content type. So if it's a blog, then I call it blog. And if it's a article, then I call it article. But I set my field layouts by a new layout for every entry type. So
Yeah, see, I mean, the thing is that, Michael, you're at a disadvantage because you're a really smart guy. Um, I'm kind of dumb, so I can think more like, the way a lot of the clients are that are using the site, and try to keep things as absolutely dirt simple as possible for them. Because
Is it really a skill? Because I feel I have this skill too sometimes. I'm just really slow at understanding certain things, which makes me feel really close to like the new user who just doesn't have a clue what anybody's talking about.
but that's useful. That's a useful thing to have because you can actually connect with and understand where clients are coming from. Whereas Michael is in Mensa and is soaring,
but
10,000 feet above everybody. So.
I would like to think I have decent empathy with my clients. The reason that I really started doing that, actually naming tabs after the entry content type, is that if you are editing a piece of content, I want you to have a little subtle reminder of where you are, so that if you think that you're editing an article, but actually the tab says blog, then maybe it throws up a little flag. Oh, I'm in the wrong tab of my browser. Maybe I don't want to make this edit here.
Yeah, and this doesn't really fall under the topic du jour, but if you find that you're creating an entry that has like 20 different tabs, it might be time to step back and say, well, maybe some of this should be in a separate section,
Yep.
and it should be related to this particular thing. Or if you're doing everything in a matrix field and then you end up with 20 different kinds of matrix blocks that people can add, it might be a time to take a step back and look at what you're doing and say, is someone reasonably going to be able to use this?
So I have a question regarding that. So at some point, how do you guys decide then whether something should be an entry type? Because in some ways I feel like an entry type, all those fields could be shoved into another tab in and of itself, and it's less discoverable. So that's what I did when I had to import an old WordPress site to a client site. I actually made it an entry tab because it's super hard to entry type because it's super hard to actually find, but it's still part of that channel.
Yeah.
But I noticed that one of the demos that you guys were showing was that there was like an import field that seemed really prominent. And I don't know whether or not that's something that clients should see. So I'm just trying to figure out what's your decision-making process when you're deciding okay, we need all these fields in this channel. But they're not always needed, so I'm gonna shove them into a tab. Or is it at that point you're like, this is so many fields, I'm gonna put it as an entry type? What's the process there?
Well, I'll make that decision based on how the template needs to be. Like if you had the difference between selling a new car and a used car, you don't want all those fields on the same entry type for the client because they'll mix and match the used car stuff. So if your template needs to be drastically different enough, then for me that's what determines the new entry type.
Yeah, it's like and it's like variations on the same content. So there, your example is car and variation on car. I think entry type has to be a large enough variation on a particular type of content that it's not yet another type of content, but it is, you still, if you were editing cars in your system, you want to be on the cars thing. And then that next layer, the way I think about it, Steve or Leia, is that it's like whenever your UI starts to get too many conditionals in it, you're like, if you're trying to explain to a client, well, if this is true, then you'd use this field, and if that is true, use that field. Whenever, I don't like doing that once. Usually if I have to do that once, I'm thinking about how to simplify it so there's no choice, or there's an opt-in, and then the fields appear after that in some way. But I think in some cases, the opt-in is so large that you end up deciding, oh, this should just be a separate entry type.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, for me it goes back to trying to put myself in my client's mindset and trying to make the control panel match, trying to make the authoring experience match as closely as possible what's already in their head, how they think about their content. So if if in my client's thought, a used car is fundamentally different than a new car, then that needs to be a different kind of content, because in their head, that is a different type of real-world thing that they are representing with this content, and it will probably have very different sets of fields. And so that's kind of my litmus test is, well, does my client think these two things are different? And does my client expect to author these two things in a slightly different way? And if so, then I will give them a different field layout for each of those things because they expect them to be different.
So you take an almost object-oriented approach to it. So if a new car and a used car are different objects, similar but different, then you give them separate entry types.
Right.
Yeah, and if there's no chance that one thing would ever become another thing, you're not going to put the used car warranty on the new car, so those options would never ever apply.
Right, and I think Ben phrased it well, that it's about streamlining their experience so that they don't have to sit and be confused by fields that are not relevant to the piece of content that they want to edit right then. And it's worth noting that it is relatively trivial to swap entry types around. If you decide one day that all of your old used cars and your new cars are actually the same thing, then you can merge them into a single entry type. That's like one database query. And so it's not like has long-term, you're not locking yourself into a long-term catastrophe by splitting out entry types, but I'm still usually pretty hesitant to create too many of them because it can get confusing at either extreme.
Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
I was going to say, here's my biggest issue with having multiple entry types. The clients don't tend to see that drop-down menu. It's just stuck off in a weird corner of the screen, and like so many times a client is like, well, wait, where's the field for this? I was like, you're on the wrong entry type, but that's, and yeah, you explain it to them once and they get it, but it's just the positioning of it is a little bit weird.
I think that's more of a UI problem than a how to organize the concepts problem, though. To me, that's Pixel and Tonic, when you upgraded to 2.5, that field disappeared from everybody in the interface, but they could improve on that. Again.
Well, it is a Pixel and Tonic problem, right? But it's also a client problem, therefore it's our problem. And I've run into that too, where the clients just don't see it, or they don't know that it's there. And
CSS.
But also, I think that the answer is different for different clients. Like, we have lots of clients who used Expression Engine a lot, and we made extensive use of the entry types field type in Expression Engine, which let you do like conditional field display logic, which was awesome. And those clients love splitting out their content, their pages, into different entry types in Craft. It makes perfect sense to them. They go look for that field. They expect it to be there. Great. Other clients don't conceive of their content in that way, and so the experience that I design for them is different.
Sure. Go ahead.
Again, I think that's an argument for granular field permissions and conditional fields. I would much rather put a drop down at the beginning of that entry that says new or used and have all that stuff cascade later than to manually switch entry types.
Yeah.
Well, somebody find out the address of Pixel and Tonic's new office and send them a case of whiskey, and
we send them a case of whiskey, nothing's going to get done.
Well,
what are you talking about?
All right, send them half a case. We got to find their Balmer's Peak.
Yeah, there it is.
Can I mention one other little plugin that I think is super useful? Going back to Andrew's comment about if you're editing your content with 20 different tabs open, and immediately my mind went to when I have 20 different Chrome tabs open, and half of them are for a dev site, and then some of them are for a staging site, and some of them are for a live site, and it's all the same project that I'm working on, but I constantly find myself tripping over which environment I'm in and like making changes in the wrong place. And so the plugin that I want to point out is a plugin called Environment Label, which used to be called Label Environment, and then in 2.0 it switched to being called Environment Label, since I think that makes a ton more sense. And it looks like this. And here I'm on a dev server, and so I have a big giant banner up top that says, "Do not put live content here." And basically, this is a plugin that you drop in, and then you can edit the caption and the color of this banner in your config files. And since they're in config files, then you can change them up in different environments. And so nowadays, I will have I install this on all my sites to keep myself from shooting myself in the foot and editing content in the wrong place
Just
when I
to
have.
make sure all the great ideas we discussed here actually get applied to the right site database.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I usually, sometimes I'll hide that banner altogether on a production site, and then on a staging site, maybe I'll make it one of the brand colors and say, "You're on a staging site, be careful, because the world can't see what you do here." And then on a dev site, then I make it nice and big and red so that I know that anything that I do is never going to see the light of day.
Pretty cool.
That's a made by Kind. That's a Tom Davies project, by the way.
Imagine to be a good signal for client, because in larger projects you'll have clients actually accessing the dev site too, and it actually becomes a nice area where they can. I find when you give clients access to a dev site, sometimes they'll test more because they don't. On a live site, even saying you can just create a draft or just turn the status to off, it's still like, what if I do it wrong? It might be live. There's a little anxiety there, so you give them a separate domain, and a lot of the anxiety goes away, and they know they can break everything, and it won't matter.
So just a couple of comments that I wanted to make on, getting back to what Leah was asking about in terms of entry types. So I kind of think of the entry layouts kind of the same way that I think about government forms, right? And nothing is more annoying that, if you're down at the county clerk's office, you get some form and you fill it out and you wait in line and you bring it to the little office, and they're like, "Oh no, you filled out the wrong form. You don't need, form TP 107-5. You need TP 107-6, or whatever." And I think that sometimes clients get similarly confused with the entry types just because of how they are kind of hidden away. I try to think about it from the perspective of, if it's something that is, if there are things that are similar but different, and it's complex enough that it's worth having to train them to go to different entry types, then I will do that. If it's not, I'm kind of in line with what Steve is talking about, where I would prefer to have everything just be there on one page. And if there's a tab, the tab is there for stuff that I don't really want them to see. And I agree with Michael, yes, it depends on your client, and it also depends on the complexity of what you are doing. But I would also love to see conditional fields where they have one form and it changes based on what they're picking, so that it's much more a much more simplified entry process. If you look at the way Typeform works, for instance, and I don't recommend going to that extreme, but they keep it really simple, where it's one question at a time, and you see the progress and all that kind of good stuff. I would really like to see one entry form where what is displayed is dependent on a couple of choices that are made, rather than having it be kind of tucked off in the corner in entry types.
You could probably write a future compatible plugin that grabs the entry types and just makes it a conditional field.
I was just thinking that, why don't we just move that field into, right above the content tabs?
Give it an option to be in the sidebar or as a switch field or something.
Yeah, I just think it needs to be a lot more prominent, and that would definitely help. But I also, it's analogous. The entry types are analogous to block types, right? They're really the same thing. So you've got a matrix block and you have different block types. And that's one, I'm slightly concerned about some sites that, everything is a matrix block, because you could, in Craft, in theory, you could make one section and that's the only section on the whole site, and then you'd have just different entry types for every little different thing in there. And that's analogous to having one matrix block where you just have lots of different block types that build up the content. And I think we just really need to spend a decent amount of time up front thinking about how does the client think about these things that they're entering, and how does it make the most sense to logically group this stuff so that it makes sense to the client. Not that it makes sense to us or that it conforms to the database or whatever, but how is this content going to make the most sense to the client when they're in there trying to work on it?
I mean, entry types feel more like they're for the developer, really. Because that's so you can combine different kinds of content into a single channel and not have to do array merges and stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a huge component of entry types that faces the developer, specifically around templates. If two pieces of content need to be in the same section, but I'm going to render them with two separate templates, then that's a case for entry types. And actually, the screen that I'm already sharing is the perfect example, because I've got one structure that creates the hierarchy for the entire site, and some of the pages are redirects, and some of them are content pages, and some of them are landing pages, and those not only have a completely different set of fields, but because of that, they have a completely different template. And so making them entry types means that they all can exist in the same section, and the client can see their outline of their whole site without needing to switch back and forth between different sections. And also, I have the benefit in my template of being able to have a single base template and a single include statement that just dynamically includes a template that uses the same name as the entry type, and away I go. And so there's a lot of cleanliness in the code that comes from that as well.
I think this is a perfect example of what I was talking about. This makes complete logical sense, or I would think, to the average person looking at it, that here are a bunch of pages, and here's the hierarchy of these pages, and there can be different types of pages, and this is the kind of organization that I think would make complete sense to the average person that is looking at it. I just wish that the entry type stuff was not quite so hidden. And yeah, like you said, we can train them, but I think it should be a little more prominent.
Or there's this nifty plugin. It's called CPJS, and it lets you just grab a field and splurt it out somewhere else.
Yes. I'm
going to try that. I'm going to try that today, because I think that from a UI standpoint, that would make such a big difference to the usability of entry types.
It really would. It really would, because if there's some kind of a huge, big selector up there, that you have to pick something, and you could even make it, in an ideal world, like nothing is displayed until they pick something. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that would make a huge difference in terms of usability and also, from a training point of view of, bringing someone new in to look at it instead of having to show them, no, it's it's hidden up in this little thing over here.
Yeah. One thing that we have done is, and I don't often do this because most of my clients don't need it, but I have created a base entry type that has an empty field layout except for one field, and I use my field notes plugin for it, and it just says, please select a page type. And
I like it.
And then they do. And again, most of my clients don't need that, but you can do that.
Or it could be a video that shows that with an arrow that points to that little
arrow,
thing.
Yeah.
Picture of the CEO just pointing.
But again, this discussion begs for every single one of us to go to the craft feature list and upvote, something about making the entry type stuff more prominent, I think. Because it would not be hard to do, and I think would make a qualitative difference.
Well, I think it might be fun to do a separate hangout focused more on the customization of fields and layouts too. It sounds like there's a lot more to think about how we, how a lot of the framing of that happens, as that is a large part of the backend customization.
Leah, does that answer your question, or have you gone away?
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. The interesting thing, though, is you guys have been talking a lot about making it more discoverable. In the one place that I used it for a client, I purposely chose it because it wasn't discoverable.
Ah, right. Right.
Because for example, it was the old imported content with slightly different fields.
Perfect.
And so I just wanted to do a one-to-one, association to that, and I just did conditionals in a template, and that's, be done with it. And then there's no accidentally adding new content to an incorrect field simply because the feature was they couldn't find it. But I think part of me is just trying to figure out is that almost what they wanted to do with
I don't think so.
And I don't think that was it. But it also, now that you brought that up, and I was thinking about why I did it in the first place, if they made entry types a lot more discoverable, how would you guys hide? Would the tab be the way you guys hide things that shouldn't be?
Well, I mean, if they did first of all, yeah, if we all get our feature requests that we want, you're going to be pissed off because it's going to ruin it.
I don't know if I kind of like the sidebar location of it personally. I don't know if I'd want it in all situations. I think it's a good idea to have. I think if you added the conditional field stuff, I'm not sure it would matter anymore that it was on the side there. But the idea of where you place it being an optional decision by the person setting up the site, I think is a good one.
In an ideal world, Leah, they implement the access permissions for user groups. Maybe they do it based on field layout or fields in particular, and then what you can do is you can just import all of this stuff. It can be in that channel, but the average user can never see it. But that is predicated on them implementing some features that aren't there yet.
Cool.
But I do the same kind of thing you do. I put stuff in a tab when I don't want people to see it, and it's kind of the same idea of hiding it away in an entry type. So I think it makes complete sense until they make it more discoverable.
All right. Well, any final thoughts? Might be time to wrap up here.
I don't know.
All right.
I'll just say something cheesy like, with great power comes great responsibility. So hack your admin CP, wisely, I guess, or be careful when you do it.
Yeah. I think that's a fair analysis. There's a lot you can do, but you can get enough rope to hang yourself with. So just be careful.
The more you can do, the more you can screw up.
Yep.
We'll be revisiting this conversation with you, Lindsay, at Craft 3.0 to see how it went.
When I'm in tears about how broken everything is.
I'll bet you that Lindsay is going to be happy as a clam because I bet you it just works.
Oh man, that would make my day.
Well, and I think the counter to that is if you're going to do a bunch of customization, then make sure that you also give yourself a little bit of slack and have a moderately sized maintenance agreement that says when major updates come out, we have the budget to make sure all this stuff still works the way you expect it to.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I think you mentioned that earlier that, on a small site with a small budget, I probably would never even consider doing this because, then later on when I update their craft and stuff breaks, they're gonna be like, well, what the hell? You've got to fix this, and they're not going to pay for it. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, with that said, with great power comes great responsibility.
There you
Summary
go.
of the last 2 hours. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you for coming out, everybody, and thank you all for your unique contributions and thoughts on this. I know it's a big topic and a fun one.
Is that from
So much
Spider-Man?
fun.
What is that quote from?
It didn't start
Yeah.
with it was like a Voltaire quote or something like that.
We'll let
But
it
yeah,
we'll let it be
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man for this.
I'm going to attribute it to Spider-Man.
It was Uncle Ben.
It's an Uncle Ben quote, yeah.
There you go. Uncle
All right.
Ben. Screw this
All right.
Voltaire guy. We're giving it to Uncle Ben.
Straight Up Hangouts is a weekly event presented by Barrel Strike Design and Pixel and Tonic. Next week we'll be back discussing Flexbox again and all the power we have in the BYO HTML craft template. Thank you for coming out. Craft the planet.